I'm very honored and thrilled to be part of this seminar, and actually to get to talk and introduce to you some parts of my book that I hope will be particularly relevant for what I understand is your project. So let me just share my screen, and hopefully we'll be able to start. Okay. Maybe if I start from the beginning, it's better. Okay, so thanks for the introduction. And indeed, yes, today I'm presenting my first monograph that just came out with Indiana University Press, titled "Engineering Global Socialism: Ownership, Non-Alignment, and Corporate Culture in a Bosnian Company." So the Bosnian company that I refer to is the company Energoinvest, that you will hear about quite a lot throughout the presentation. But before getting into the specifics of the book, I think I thought I would start with sharing kind of the initial questions and puzzles that I had as part of this research, which was essentially the beginning of my PhD research. So I started my PhD in 2014, which feels like ages ago at this point. And at that time, there had been a very significant protests across Bosnia, where we saw mass social mobilizations of people essentially manifesting their rage and discontent towards what was viewed as essentially a failed economic transformation, a failed and a series of very, very negative consequences of privatization and transformations that had come with the transition, essentially, the transformation into a market-led economy. And so what I was interested in understanding as a historian, essentially, was, what were the root causes and what had led to such discontent, what was lost in this process, and what was reclaimed, and what promises had been disattended, and with what consequences. So, to fully grasp the experience of late socialism and its transformation, in this book, I essentially look at three interconnected themes across a chronology that spans from the 1980s essentially to the present day. And I argue that it's important to consider the different and at times conflicting promises that socialism and post-socialism brought. And so throughout the book, I employ the trope of promise as both an analytical and a historical category. So a tool to understand transformations, to navigate the rationale of its protagonists, but also to unpack the disconnections between experience and expectations of transformation within the microcosm of one enterprise, one workplaces. So as the book shows, Yugoslav enterprises and Energoinvest as one of them were spaces where we see actually different competing promises of progress through global integration coexisting across this chronology. First, the promise of development and globality crafted under socialism, and second, the promise of neoliberal global integration to be achieved through privatization, liberalization, and essentially what was viewed at the time in the 1990s and 2000s, the dismantling of socialism's clunky industrial structures. So Energoinvest was one of the largest companies in Yugoslavia. It was arguably at one point the largest enterprise in Bosnia, develops from the 1950s onwards as a composite enterprise that did industrialization projects, particularly particularly of engineering, infrastructural development, electrification, hydropower, power stations across the world, as we can see here in this map at the center. Those are just some of the countries where this company operated. And so I believe that actually zooming in on a single company provides a unique vantage point through which we can understand real and long-term implications of, on one hand, the global promise of Yugoslav socialism, but also the consequences and the outcomes of its dismantling. So what was essentially part of this kind of global promise is what I analyze and look at in the book. In terms of the sources that I look at, I looked at national, local, international archives. I looked at one of the key and I think most interesting sources was the company journal, which you see pictured here, having kind of reminding readers of a variety of kind of news and the kinds of news or articles that were presented in on its pages, but also crucially, and this is what I would like to expand on, particularly today, given the audience that we have here, oral history interviews. What is interesting here is that the history of Energoinvest, as I see through, as I trace through these sources, essentially mirrors in small the major transformations that Bosnia and Yugoslavia beyond that underwent as late socialist regimes crumbled and war ensued. Energoinvest crucially remained active throughout the Bosnian War, and so did its company journal, as you can see pictured here at the bottom left. And so this really provided a unique insight into a company at war. And this micro perspective, this combination of particularly the company journal and the oral history interviews really reveals at close range what kind of expectations and debates emerged in the face of multiple transformations and violent dissolution, and how these went on to mold post-socialist workplaces. So this is just the kind of the book structure. You see Energoinvest pictured, its main headquarters pictured here on the right in Sarajevo. So the book develops alongside 7 thematic chapters. It starts with a bird's eye view of the intellectual, social, and political history of what I call is the Yugoslav socialist promise, so an articulation of globally oriented visions of economic integration mediated through enterprises. So I look at how the project of non-alignment was also an economic project that featured Yugoslav enterprises at their core, and Energoinvest as one of them. The following chapter traces the effects of the crisis of global socialism in the 1980s, the debt crisis, and the kind of fracturing of the promises of non-alignment as well, the effect that this had onto globally embedded enterprises such as Energoinvest. Chapter 3 zooms in onto the crisis of the Yugoslav model of self-management and workers' ownership, and the different kind of promises of ownership reform that were developed under the last Yugoslav government of Ante Markovic. This follows then is followed by a focus on the war in Bosnia as experienced within workplaces through the eyes of workers and the words of the company's journal. What I then discuss is that essentially the war ushered in new promises of deservingness and reward that actually fractured workplaces by championing an ethno-nationalization of the world of work. This then transformation clashed with visions of economic integration of former socialist corporations like Energoinvest, whose fate as globally embedded exporters was put into question as part of the post-war privatization reforms. And in the final chapter, I actually reflect on the contrasts between, on one hand, kind of divided workplaces, but also the kind of expectations and visions, persisting expectations and visions of global integration that we see still shape workers' communities. So this is kind of just an overview of the book, and now I'm going to go into some of the arguments, and I will illustrate some of the ideas and main conclusions that come from the book. So as I mentioned, one of the key points and discussions, and is part actually of the subtitle of the book as well, one of the key words is non-alignment, and how I frame non-alignment as also a Yugoslav global promise. One where we see enterprises, particularly construction, engineering enterprises, not only Energoinvest, of course, but we see Energoprojekt, we see several other Yugoslav enterprises really involved in essentially forming the bedrock of the political economy at the end of the day of non-alignment and of Yugoslavia's foreign policy towards its non-aligned partners. So we see that export-oriented large companies are really protagonists here of economic exchanges and development with development projects carried out particularly in partnership with world, global south, non-aligned countries, where they particularly carry out projects in the energy, construction, and extractive sectors abroad, through which essentially they establish economic and technical cooperation with the non-aligned world. And crucially, as this book shows, we see that these enterprises, like Energoinvest, were protagonists of joint projects of industrialization, both domestically and abroad. The growth of an enterprise like Energoinvest, which, you know, it's very huge for what was at the time the fairly small Bosnian market, was essentially due to the fact that it established these strong partnerships with across the world, of course, with European markets, with the Soviet Union as well, but also and crucially with countries such as Iraq, Iran, Ethiopia, where it was really one of the pioneers. The second keyword of the subtitle, which is crucial again to kind of understand how this project or promise was articulated and delivered within enterprises and workplaces, is socialist corporate culture. So Energoinvest, like many other large enterprises actually in Yugoslavia, but across the socialist world. And I think this is quite interesting, particularly if we contextualize this within the broader historiography of business history, of business studies, where really socialist enterprises are only very recently kind of being considered as enterprises, as economic actors. These were places where, and spaces where what I define as a socialist corporate culture was really very much cultivated. So a sense of belonging and of investment within the company, towards the company and its destiny, was something that was very much cultivated, not only from the bottom up, but from the top down as well, through several events, as we see pictured here. For example, they would have sports competitions organized within and between branches of the company that were scattered around Yugoslavia. They even had at some point a company song that they commissioned to a very famous Bosnian singer at the time. So the company really had this sense of building a sense of belonging amongst its workers, something that was related back to me through many interviews as something that really fostered and created a strong sense of identity and belonging amongst workers. And finally, the third keyword of the subtitle is ownership. And I trace the transformations of ownership through cycles of reform throughout this kind of long chronology that spans essentially the late socialist period, the war and post-socialist transformations that we see across essentially transforming Energoinvest and its ownership structure across several cycles of reform. So we see that, and I discussed this particularly in chapters 3 and 5, we see competing visions of market integration and privatization being part of an ongoing struggle over actually the meaning of work, the meaning of identity, of ownership, and of deservingness that become articulated in different ways across these multiple transformations. And so we see actually an emerging complex articulation of progress at the end of the day, articulated as kind of different formulations of ownership, different formulation of what privatization and what companies should look like in a new economic system. And through these, essentially, the reframing of categories related to the world of work. So we move from, a system of self-management, of social ownership, through several iterations of essentially a hollowing out of that meaning of ownership, a moving away of those of the legal tenets of workers' ownership, into essentially first voucher privatization, then new forms of neoliberal privatization. This is kind of a quite complex set of transformations. I'm happy to talk through them in the Q&A. As I mentioned, I also trace the role of, and I think this is particularly interesting in the kind of chronology that I chose to look at, the transformation of the workplace at war and of a business at war was particularly interesting for me, as it emerged again, obviously as a crucial theme, and not only in the archival sources that I had, but also especially from the oral history interviews. And this was quite interesting, and I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A, the extent to which I didn't really go into the interviews thinking that I would ask about the war, and that actually came out kind of organically through my to the discussions I had with the people who I was so lucky to kind of hear experiences from. What is crucial here is that we see that there is essentially a shift. The spatial division of a country at war, that becomes fractured along essentially different territorial claims of different opposing armies, entails actually and results in the fracturing of what was until then considered kind of a national enterprise. So during the war and as an outcome of the war, we see the emergence of Energoinvest that belongs to the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and an Energoinvest that belongs to Republika Srpska. And across that, and particularly in Sarajevo, this means a fracturing of the workforce as well. Workers who were also conscripted as fighters, even though they really oppose this. And we can see this from some of the pictures here. This is an early demonstration in 1990 in Sarajevo, where workers and citizens came to the streets en masse under this banner that says "Workers yes, fighters no." And we see that actually this opposition becomes essentially fractured and is destroyed by the very kind of acceleration and intensification of the conflict within of the war in Bosnia, where workers unwillingly essentially move from this kind of understanding of themselves as owner to this understanding of themselves as fighters, as defenders of their workplaces, which again becomes fractured, as I mentioned. Afterwards, and this is where I think some of the core kind of themes of the book may particularly appeal to the audience of today, and in fact, I'd be happy to discuss more, especially within the kind of framework of your very exciting project. I look, of course, at what happens after the war, after cycles of privatization, and after we see essentially an acceleration of deindustrialization across the Yugoslav space within Bosnia, the deindustrialization and ruination that affects the physical work spaces, industrial spaces that belonged to this company across Bosnia. These are just some of the pictures that I took of former industrial sites. So we see that throughout essentially deindustrialization, the space of the workplace lays in ruins as a consequence of the war and cycles of privatization. But what emerged that I found was quite interesting was that as I spoke to several former workers, their identity as owners of the factories emerged somehow seemingly unscathed from the ashes of the socialist collapse. And so I was interested to understand how and why do people still identify as owners of their factories and are still willing to fight for shares and ownership of their companies, even though these actually bear little resemblance to the once celebrated grandiosity of their socialist days. And so to understand this, I think it's key to observe workplaces as site of multiple and at times competing processes of identity transformation. And so we see in the case of Bosnia and of Energoinvest that economic reconstruction and nation building actually sutured together the process of privatization with that of ethnicization. And so Energoinvest was at the center of a model of ethnic privatization, so of privatization along essentially ethnic lines that completely fragmented this global giant and its workforce, but that also created a strong opposition and resistance amongst workers. So in the last few minutes that I have, I would like to kind of delve deeper into some of the aspects of the questions related to oral history interviews and to memory and to the questions of kind of promises and expectations and how we trace these through these interviews. So in the book, I introduce what I call structures of expectations. Where it's essentially a concept that I develop kind of in response or building upon the use of perhaps the more kind of notorious concept of structure of feeling that is employed frequently in studies on deindustrialization, but I also draw upon Reinhard Koselleck's formulation of spaces of experiences and horizons of expectation. And here I'm interested in understanding how the people I spoke to essentially mediated an experience, mediated the tensions between the experience of the transformation and the expectations that they had. So these were the people I spoke to were essentially a generation of workers who started their professional lives at the heyday of industrialization, of socialist internationalism, of the Yugoslav global non-aligned promise. And who experienced, even if they remained kind of physically tied to their specific workplace within Bosnia, and maybe they didn't travel to Energoinvest branches abroad, they still experienced this kind of global embeddedness in, for example, the destinations of their product, in the kind of corporate culture narratives that the company reported back to them, and in the general kind of sense of identification with this global story. They then experienced kind of the promises and letdowns of reform, fought in the war, and adjusted to new post-socialist societies. And so when I look at their kind of discussions and how they mediate, their experience of these transformations, but also the expectations that they had from different promises, the promise of Yugoslav socialism, the promise of post-socialist prosperity, renewed global integration, etc. I see that a kind of a structure of expectations emerges here. It's something more than a structure of feeling. It's more than just habits of thought or industrial cultural forms. It actually sets the expectations grounded upon the values, practices, and narratives around which one's work life is structured. In this case, the promises of industrial prosperity, of internationalization and ownership, is something that really framed and structured these workers' expectations, and in fact guided their requests and demands from newly post-socialist systems that were carrying out new cycles of reform and of privatization. Their demands were very much grounded and based upon the expectations that they had from kind of renewing or getting back towards their own experience and their own expectations of transformation and of a specific kind of work life. What I also discuss and what emerged in the interviews, from the interviews, is a kind of a hierarchical setting of memory, where we see a kind of a relational dialogue between, of course, different and at times conflicting memories. I think the condensed set of transformations that occur in this case, we see state socialism's collapse, war, deindustrialization, privatization, neoliberal integration, but which is kind of lopsided somehow, creates distinctive and often conflicting, again, sets of expectations that are then kind of mobilized and remembered at times as kind of conflicting, and that are set then in a kind of selective form in workers' discussions. So what was crucial and what emerged quite evidently throughout the interviews was that many of my interlocutors were kind of bringing up values of the kind of the old socialist corporate culture as something desirable and something that they would that they valued as essentially as a positive experience. And so they would have expected from post-war privatization to essentially go back to some of those forms of corporate culture, of feeling of ownership, etc. But they also needed to see workers' contribution to the war being recognized. And one of the key systems of this recognition that was actually sanctioned at the state and national level was essentially to distribute vouchers or ownership shares through those workers who had fought in the war. This being a divided war, that meant that different forms, different parts of the company were distributed differently by different entities within Bosnia to their different veterans. So here we see a kind of a conflicting experience and demand coming from workers across the different kind of entities that constitute Bosnia today, so from Republika Srpska and the Federation, that essentially on one hand were valuing, the general kind of socialist understanding of workers' ownership, but at the same time wanted to be compensated and validated an understanding of compensation through ownership being essentially framed in ethno-national terms because veterans had to be compensated first. So we see here kind of the emergence of a hierarchical understanding that is of memory making, of the kind of bringing up of different values and the importance of these different values in a selective way as we kind of, well, as actors remember these different moments. So just to conclude, I will wrap up on the main arguments and the key interventions, and then I will happily take your questions. So I think the three main points that I would like to kind of leave you with that come from the book, I think are first that this kind of socialist global promise, so this interconnection via export-oriented enterprises with a global outlook, has also crucially a local dimension and affected workers' expectations of reward and their understanding of ownership. What came after, so this kind of neoliberal promise of renewed global integration, of globalization, of market integration, did not actually fully supplant that, and in fact entailed a reversal, a marginalization, a deglobalization through the fracturing of international ties in view of privatization and regional outlooks. And what results from these kind of contested and overlapping promises is a complex juncture of worker, owner, fighter, ethnic citizen, and which kind of as a formulation of a complex identity that emerged in the conversations I had with many of my interlocutors. And so the prominence of these different kind of features of identity is selected and made sense of in hierarchical terms through also the space of the workplace and the claims to the workplace. So finally, in terms of the key interventions of the book, I think, of course, the book can speak to actually and connect global history and area studies. We see more and more in the past 10 years studies emerging on the kind of the global nature of state socialism. We know less about what the legacies of that global socialism was. And I think this book contributes to showing the extent to which that kind of project and idea really had a bearing at the local level. In terms of business history, the book shows how how important it is and how we can understand kind of perhaps European transformations and business histories also through the tracing histories of businesses of war. To the question of memory and the area of memory studies, as I hope I've shown kind of this different understandings of expectations of hierarchical memory making. But finally, I think in terms of current debates, and kind of important geopolitical turns that we've seen occurring in the past 5 years or so, where geopolitically the world is more and more polarized, but kind of new calls for perhaps non-alignment are emerging, and also calls for kind of really closing the chapter of neoliberalism and thinking about the alternatives. I think it's important also to consider how important it is for people to still hold on to some conceptions of alternatives and what it means to kind of forget them on the other hand. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I'll gladly take some questions now.